Good afternoon, Europe. Good morning, the US. Really excited to have you today for this webinar about cyber fraud and the release of this survey. Just let us know if you can hear me well or not. Should be okay. Yes, it seems to be okay. We'll let you a few more seconds or minutes to ensure everybody can join. Really excited by this session today because as everybody is speaking about how to break the silos within finance teams, we have a great panel today with leaders from the procurement world, treasury world, even the bank and software world. So that's a very, very exciting session that we'll have today. Before we start, and just the administrative side of this session. The webinar is recorded, so no worries if you or someone else from your team could not join. You will receive a replay by email directly. The idea is to make this session really collaborative, so feel free to share your opinion, answer polls, etc. But as well, you can ask questions. There is a dedicated tab, and at the end of the webinar, we will take a time to answer some of the questions. If we don't have time, we'll make sure that we answer after the webinar. The team will reach out after this. Panel of the day, really great panel today. And my name is Baptiste Collot, co-founder, CEO of Trustpair. I'm a former treasurer, so I come from the corporate world before jumping into entrepreneurship to solve this big issue that we all hear about today, which is fraud. But today, I'm so pleased to have Lee-Ann, Gloria, and Michael on this session to discuss the release of the new survey we shared a few weeks ago about the trend around cyber fraud in 2024 and what to expect in 2025. So honor to women. Lee-Ann, can you introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for including us all in this webinar today. I am so grateful to be able to learn from others, particularly our panelists on the call today. And I'm such, I've been in treasury for about 21 years in global companies, and I'm such an advocate for learning. I'm curious, I love to be trained, and I love to share information to help one another, and therefore very grateful that we're talking about fraud today, because fraud is not new in our sphere, but the types of fraud are new for all of us. So appreciate having this webinar and all the information on the fraud survey, and look forward to the discussion today.
Thank you, Lee-Ann. Gloria as well from Kinexys and GP.
Hello, thank you so much for having me. Really glad to be able to be exchanging thoughts here. I think when we first started with Kinexys, one of the big mission is to bring data collaborations across the industry to solve real problems. And when we started going to the market and talking to many different corporates and financial institutions, we realized how big of a problem and concerns when it comes to fraud preventions. And we've also seen some progress in terms of how to bring data visibilities and transparencies to help different institutions to help them manage the risk, to better educate the available tools and available challenges, and how to really just bring the intelligence and information together. So very excited to be able to participate in this discussion, but also bring awareness in general to the whole industry.
Thank you very much, Gloria. And the last but not the least, Michael from Coupa.
Yes, so thanks as well. It's always a pleasure and an honor to be on a panel with so much brain power. My name is Michael van Keulen. I'm the chief procurement officer at Coupa. I've been in procurement and finance for over 20 years. Previously, I worked for large global retailers like Foot Locker, VF Corporation, and most recently Lululemon. My background is, of course, finance and procurement, so I'll try to bring that lens. I mean, obviously, we're always thinking about it through people, process, and technology, and we'll get to that. Of course, I work for Coupa, so technology is right at the heart of the company that I work for, but definitely don't want to lose sight on importance of people first. We're the the first line of defense, as my head of GRC always reminds everybody. And then, of course, thinking about how you operationalize yourselves appropriately, and then ideally you'll have technology and AI, and we'll get into that to augment that. But I really look forward to the discussion, and thanks again for having me.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for being here and bring all this knowledge and to all the attendees. Quick word about Trustpair. We are an enterprise-grade platform for payment fraud prevention. We support large companies to prevent vendor payment fraud, basically by ensuring they have the right data to make the right decision. Basically, vendor payment fraud is all about paying the right bank account, paying the right company. This is what we bring. We work with a lot of companies worldwide, 400 clients, and why we exist today in this industry and why we lead this industry is because we answer a big need for clients, for large companies, which is a global coverage. We have been able to process evaluations in 190 countries, but as well to bring this evaluation, bank account ownership evaluation at the right time, at the right moment in the process. And this is a key topic. Native integrations with all procure to pay and treasury systems is absolutely key. Let's jump in the topic of the day, fraud report, and just explaining how we get all this data. First, well, 200 financial professionals have been asked about what they have seen over the last year and in regarding to vendor fraud or fraud in general, in fact, and we'll see that in the survey, we start with a global scope and we are more and more precise, and this is what is very interesting with the new trends, new topics around AI, etc. Companies for more than 1 billion of revenue, mainly based in the US, and the survey was conducted end of last year by a specialized research organization named CIMT. Objective was really to outline fraud trends and empower companies to take action against fraud. This is a key question for everybody, how to prevent fraud. And out of this survey, we decided when we did prepare this webinar to focus on mainly 7 insights that are really key, in our opinion, about fraud. The first one, and again, we'll start global and being more and more precise over these 7 insights, is that cyber fraud is surging. Cyber fraud is a concern. You hear about cyber fraud everywhere. The question is how you can and how companies are targeted around this. Well, the figure speaks by itself, basically. 90% of US companies targeted by cyber fraud in 2024. And it is a really significant increase as last year was 79% in 2023. So maybe one question for you, Gloria, first. How many, as companies are really attacked, how do you think they should act in this regarding this trend, how companies can address and this big threat, which is cyber fraud?
Absolutely. I think previously, and obviously like fraud has always been a concern, but a lot of the time when we hear corporate treasurers and clients, a lot of the focus has been, how do I make my money movement faster? Like I need to make sure the payment settles a lot faster. It's because they took secure and safe payment to be delivered in the destination for granted. And we really did see that shift in the past, I would say 12 to 18 months, that more and more clients coming in and asking, like, in addition to make my payment faster, how do I actually make my payment more secure? What are the toolings that I can implement? What are the change of behaviors I can implement within my operations to help better manage that risk? Now, like we do see that shift from a client demands perspective. One more lens that I would share is also as institutions and as businesses expanding on their operations, building broader partnerships across the board, the risk is also increasing as well, right? Like previously, you have a much more controlled scale of payment footprints. And this applies both in the financial institutions as well as in the corporate world. And then that prompt a more risk to be exposed and more clients looking into solutions to help them manage some of the risks.
And, how do you uh, how do you see that trend? Because again, so whole companies are eight to date. There is no one companies that are, when you say 90%, basically it's more a question of when you will be it rather than if you will be it. And I think in when we did prepare the webinar, it was a discussion. I think Lee-Ann, you mentioned this that all teams are expanding globally, especially in the treasury world. How companies can react today, how they can consider this risk from more a treasury perspective.
Yeah, and I really like what you said, Gloria, that we really have to go back to the basics. We have this great technology of real-time payments and faster payments, but at the same time, we have to make sure the payments we make are safe and settled securely. And back to what you asked, Baptiste, that treasury teams are already expanding globally, and this is increasing the exposure to new types of risks across particularly emerging markets. And I think it goes back to everyone in the company has to be involved in fraud mitigation and have a culture of the awareness of fraud. And this has got to start right from when the contract negotiations happen, right to the confirmation and reconciliation of funds. And then whether your company is truly global in location or just makes and receives cross-border payments, there are inherent risks that we have to all be aware of. And some of the blind spots I think we're seeing in our companies and in general is a lack of standardized controls and audits on a global fashion, and a lack of adequate and sometimes ineffective training and risk awareness. And that's where it leads to real concern for corporate treasury and payment departments. And then, if your organizations are not acting quickly to fortify the defenses, then the risks of successful attacks is going to grow, and it will be when you're attacked, not if you're attacked. And there is so much complexity and sophistication of these new fraud schemes, and the threat of financial losses, regulatory penalties, and reputational damage is huge. And at the end of the day, it just comes down to it's an arms race between companies and threat actors. We have to know that, we have to be aware, and we have to put processes back in place to make sure we know how to protect the payments.
It's interesting because 90% is huge, but 79% was huge as well. So the question is really, well, we know that 100% will be the end of the game. The question is why companies are really taking so much time to realize how critical this is, and the time that take to, you said, fortify their defense, etc. is surprising in a way. We have this kind of discussion for years, and we see the figures increasing years after years, and still it seems that just not a few companies really realized how important this is, and to just level up their defense and their game in terms of cyber fraud.
Yeah, and Baptiste, to me, it's not really that strange to see these numbers, because I do see in companies, while people understand fraud happens, it's not really always a top-down approach where you have a culture of fraud awareness for everybody. It's not just the payment department or the treasury team. So I can understand why these numbers are increasing. And because of the complexity of, now we have AI created fraud, if we don't keep up and we don't keep training and being curious, that number will continue to grow.
Definitely. Thank you very much for, Gloria, go ahead.
I was going to say, just to add on to Lee-Ann's point, like even sometimes when there is a top-down approach, there is the commitment from senior management, actually implementing a solution and an operational process across the board also takes time. Like we have seen a lot of corporates that has every single bit of intention, but then to be able to actually implement and incorporate some of the tooling and the practice within their day-to-day, that culture shifts and that operating model shifts takes way longer than what some of us would expect.
And Gloria, you're so right, because it also takes resources, and Treasury and payment departments are well known for not getting the funding they always require or ask for in terms of fraud mitigation tools. So you're spot on there.
And the only fact that, I mean, we have Treasury, banker, procurement involved in the same discussion just proves the complexity of this for any organization. Who should own this topic is usually one of the primary question and discussion we have with any company. So we'll go through this, and thank you very much for this point. It was the first insight. Second insight is the macroeconomic pressure. How this just mute you, Michael, and macroeconomic pressure and how these drive an increase on fraud and cyber fraud in general. And so the question was, what is most likely to lead to a higher risk of payment fraud in 2025 regarding to executives? And the two main answers were 47%, the geopolitical uncertainty. And for the second point, 31% answered economic uncertainty. So again, here, I think it's really interesting to get your views on this. Why do you think that payment fraud tactics vary probably by region? What should finance team do, well, to stay ahead of this, and how they can, and how you see that, in fact, how you can explain this from your perspective as a treasurer?
Yeah, and this is an interesting slide because I think these geopolitical and economic uncertainties really create an environment where fraud can incubate, and it becomes more prevalent because there's so many interconnected factors. And what we're seeing from the Treasury space is the increased cyber threats from nation state actors if you're working in a global company, the sanctions and payment restrictions. There's sometimes a tendency to attempt to bypass these restrictions using fraudulent methods. And we've seen them happen with shell companies or alternative digital payment types. Then on the supply chain disruption side, there has been, since COVID, so much chaos in the supply chain. And this can increase the likelihood of fraudulent vendors, fraudulent invoices, and diversion schemes. And for what we've seen, for those living in the US, there's been an escalation of geopolitical risks in the global markets with the change of administration. And sometimes these uncertainties can be very perilous for companies, C-suite trying to make numbers, and fraud can happen by inflating the value of your contracts, or what we see a lot is misrepresenting the market conditions, and this covers up losses, and it's really an issue to try to avoid these negative investor reactions. And that's why I think fraud happens, and it's a gateway to payment fraud due to these types of uncertainties.
And it's interesting because you mentioned payments and those the whole impact about supply chain disruption, just enlightening that all this is absolutely connected. Of course, Michael, from your own perspective, more as a procurement leader, how do you see that? How do you analyze these figures, and how do you believe that companies should act regarding this trend?
Yeah, I think it's kind of what Lee-Ann said, right? Is if you're in procurement and you are responsible for competitive spend, right? That's one of the elements, but the right quality and the right lead time, and business continuity, right? That's part of my remit as a procurement person, and I'm sure this resonates with those that are listening. When there is uncertainty, you very quickly have the tendency to maybe make certain things that were a higher priority in the past, maybe like put them lower on the priority list and more focus on business continuity, for example, which then can result in you sourcing from areas in the world where maybe you're not super familiar, maybe you don't understand the culture, maybe you don't understand some of the ways of working. And every country has its own dynamics, and especially emerging markets, which is often where we source from, it might result in you deprioritizing risk and risk management, and maybe prioritizing the guarantee of supply. And it has happened in my past as well, yeah, where you maybe have to rejig the puzzle a little bit, and that might then result in you increasing the risk to your company. And if you don't have the right mitigation in place, whether it's residual risk or whether it's risk as you onboard a supplier, and making sure you truly understand the business practices in that specific country or region, yeah, you might actually do your company a disservice. And so it always comes back to the basics, which is what both Lee-Ann and Gloria talked about, which is, we're the first line of defense. We have to make sure that we ask all the right questions before we even start a sourcing event, and then as you go through contracting, and just making sure you got the right protection and the right language in there, that it's almost like insurance. It's like you never know you need it, but when you do need it, you can't have enough. I look at risk no different. So we shouldn't put our guard down just because there is a lot of uncertainty out there in the public domain, but it's a very common problem that I see and hear often, and I've experienced myself as well. Sure.
We clearly see for 2025 a lot of disruptions internationally. The news, if just you open the news, you can imagine how, maybe not traumatic, but stressful it can be for any company who will probably have to deal with a lot of changes around his supply chain. And so, of course, this drive a lot of uncertainty at whole level, and this is really well reflected here. And this is something we discussed a lot in while preparing this webinar. How do you believe that internally and in the discussion you have with your peers, companies are today trying to prevent what is coming in 2025 regarding this high uncertainty, etc.?
That was a question for me. Sorry.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Yeah, I think what's important is that we think about breaking down silos. We should break down silos between the business, the treasurer, procurement, supply chain, finance, IT, GRC, legal. Like we should break down silos. And I think Lee, you said it, or maybe it was Gloria, I can't remember honestly, but is to say, like, who should own this? Well, you know what? We should all own this. It's not the responsibility of the treasurer. It's not the responsibility of somebody in accounts payable to make sure we pay the right supplier. No, it's the responsibility of all of us. And I think that the best way to arm us, yes, there is technology out there, and we'll probably get to that, Baptiste, and of course, that's where Trustpair comes in, and a company like I work for. But we should be super clear that risk mitigation, fraud prevention, it's something that we should all own together. And it's not in one silo that on its own is responsible and going to be held accountable for a set of outcomes. I think that would be, for me, would be the biggest thing that hopefully we do in 2025 and beyond. And I still think that has not happened historically. And I welcome, of course, Lee-Ann and Gloria as well.
And from my side, I totally agree with you there, Michael. And what we see in the treasury function is treasury is not always in the loop. Sometimes we are a bit reactive in the information that we're given. And it really is our job to future-proof companies as we go into different regions and to understand the risks, like you said, Michael, that we're going into and that we're going to face. And when you spoke about technology, I think it comes, I love this quote by Einstein. He said, we can't solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them. And that's why we need to use the current day's technology. We have to fight fire with fire to ensure that we can get ahead of the fraud, ahead of the risk, and we can understand how to manage it, because we're not going to do it if we just keep doing the same things that we've been doing, to fight check fraud. So I really love the use of technology, and agree with what everybody said earlier, is that it is everyone in the company's responsibility. Someone has to own it, I think, because if everyone owns it, then no one owns it. But it has to be everybody's duty to ensure what they're doing is correct, and that we know who we're paying and we know what type of risks we are facing with the work that we're doing.
Thank you. And it seems that it's really clear in the survey that the time is really now. When you look at this slide, the cost of payment fraud is just higher than it has never been. I was really, really surprised by these figures, and especially the last one. So just navigate through the slide. 95% of US companies were targeted by fraud. Then 96% were defrauded and lost money. But what was really crazy to read is like 47% of them lost more than 10 million US dollar. And this is just a crazy amount. I think what is really interesting is, of course, the cost is increasing. But I think here what appeals is we see companies being way more public than they have never been about that. Historically, it was hard to get these figures. Companies would not speak about that loudly. They would not even in a poll or in a survey. They would hide these to make sure that nobody will never know this. And today, it's clear that the issue is so huge and amounts lost because of fraud are so important that we see these figures that are kind of a shock for any person in the industry, or even just looking at it. So the question is really why, and more from a payment perspective, maybe for you, Gloria, and how AI and real-time payments have supported fraudster to achieve this kind of crazy figures. Is there a link between faster payments and bigger fraud? Well, it's a really wide and open questions, but happy to get your thoughts on this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the trend is not just in the US, it's like absolutely in the global scale. Like I mentioned at the very start of the panel about institutions expecting payments to move faster, right? And like real-time payments will deliver exact that benefit. Like now we can settle funds instantly, and the threshold is going up. Like we're now like settling millions of payments instantly between parties, which then also creates the exact loophole to allow fraudsters to move funds a lot faster. And as we see real-time payments being much more adopted in domestic rails, in certain cases, even on a cross-border basis, as funds move faster, it's harder. You have less window to catch these fraudsters. You have less time to react as well. So in turn, then we're start seeing higher value of fraud payments. We see higher volume as well. I think that's kind of the general trend we have observed. What's also interesting is as payment providers observing these trends, regulators has certainly also picked up these as well. So we are starting to see regulations coming out where mandating financial institutions, payment processing providers to provide toolings to allow them to help with their corporate clients to better manage these type of fraud risks on the real-time payments rails through the practice of pre-validation, at least being able to provide a certain level of data transparency. But on the other hand, doesn't matter how much data and how much tooling that we provide, it is also up to the corporates to actually adopt those toolings and embed those solutions within their processes. That's kind of the overall trends we're seeing, not just in the US, but on a global space.
Yeah, so the role of you clearly enlighten the responsibility of corporates on these, taking their elevating their own process, elevating their own tools to prevent this while embracing new technologies such as instant payment.
And Baptiste, can I add there from the treasury perspective? I think sometimes we are unaware of fraud that's happened in our own companies because companies don't do or ineffectively do a root cause analysis. And once you know exactly what happened and how to prevent it next time, that information should be shared amongst everybody, all the interested and affected parties in the company to prevent it from happening next time. And the same goes even if you implement technology. If you don't know what's happened and how to prevent it for next time, it's going to perpetuate. So keep doing those analyses.
Yeah,
and that's really interesting. Sorry, Baptiste, just to react onto that, like among the financial institutions, we have very similar directions of travel in terms of can we have a much more efficient mechanism of sharing fraud data across different banks, because we process large volumes. We have a much more of a market-wide scales, right? And then once we allow that type of more efficient data sharing, how do we then build that as tooling to help benefit corporates and help them manage the risk, right? But it all starts with how do we start having a real-time shared view of what are the fraud accounts, what are kind of the suspicious transactions out there.
And it's a challenge. I think it's really related to what we said at the very beginning, breaking those silos, not between the company only, like the teams, procurement, AP, treasury, but as well involving financial institutions is of course critical. It's interesting what you said, Lee-Ann, because in many discussions we have with corporates, very often when there is a fraud, well, the communication internally was a mess. Nobody was, sometimes even the fraud was detected in one team, but was not shared within the other team, like AP, for example. And so the payment was made, and you say like that's absolutely crazy, but this is actually what is happening. Just enlightening the risk of silos and how damageable is a lack of communication. And basically, we cannot blame companies because the technicity of fraud today is really high, and this is what we'll enlighten in a few minutes. But as well, if we jump from more payment, financial institution, but to the very beginning of the procure-to-pay chain, Michael, and how you see payment fraud has evolved, and what is how companies should react to that when you see these figures, etc. How do you believe that?
Yeah, I mean, of course, we're looking at we're looking at 10 million of fraudulent payments, but the impact to your reputation, to your company, to your share price. I mean, I think we saw Macy's as one of the most recent ones that come to mind. The impact to their share price was pretty painful. Yeah, that's a multitude of the actual fraud, because once you have to report this out, no one really knows how big the hole is, and the hole there was actually pretty big. And so we fundamentally believe that fraud detection is much better than after the fact realizing that there's been a fraud. Now you actually have to mitigate, but fraud detection is fraud prevention. And so the way we think about it, especially of course if you have the right software and the right technological landscape, that you can actually detect fraud before it happens. And that's where, of course, AI and generative AI really comes into play. A lot of our customers are using a platform. I'm not here to sell Coupa, but it's called SpendGuard. And what SpendGuard does is it's an AI-driven platform that will automatically detect errors, potential fraud based upon behaviors, based upon patterns, and it's based upon machine learning. So it takes away the human element, which is always biased. It's fully leveraged based on data, and it allows you to proactively get alerts, whether it's suspicious behavior of an employee, It could be suspicious behavior of a supplier. It could be both. But you really want to start having AI to alert and in real time monitor what's going on in your entire supply chain. Now, from a procurement perspective, we're very early on, right? We're at the point of sourcing. We're about to infuse risk into our company because we're about to select a third party, which by default is going to bring risk into my company. We're asking all the right questions and all the right financials and ownership structure and all these types of things. But once this company is in your environment, that's when the journey starts. That's often where procurement takes a back seat, where I always say, no, that's when procurement should actually continue to drive together with the business, make sure there's compliance to the contract. But more importantly, that there is constant monitoring of the supplier and what's happening with the supplier for the duration while they're in your environment. And it's not just at the point of a contract. No, that actually is when the journey starts. I have said, I think when we did the rehearsal, if you will, I said it almost is like marriage. You know, that's when it all starts. It's no different than when you bring on a supplier into your environment. That's when the journey starts. So I hope I get off my soapbox here, but it has to be proactive and not reactive.
You mentioned an interesting point, which is the cost, which is not only a financial cost, but reputation, etc., which is not only a concern for so the team in charge of preventing fraud, but which is a CEO concern almost, or CFO concern, board level concern. And still, in all what we discussed, we still sometimes don't know who has the ownership on this. But when you say that, when based on what was discussed, clearly fraud prevention is, as Lee-Ann said, not only the topic of one team, but the topic of everybody, meaning that this topic needs to be discussed at the highest level of the company with clear clear insights and clear targets in terms of probably investment that need to be conducted, or at least resources involved to fraud prevention to avoid this. That's very interesting because we clearly see on a daily basis with Trustpair clients, for example, that historically fraud was really seen just as a cost, like small cost. You lose 100K sometimes, okay, millions, 20 million maybe. But today, when you pay a criminal organization 2, 3, 4 times, even if it's not a high amount, well, the question is, well, what's the fine related to paying a criminal organization, potentially under sanction, etc.? Well, this is what we call at Trustpair the domino effect of fraud, which you start with a small amount lost because of fraud, but at the end, everybody can be impacted within the company. The other interesting point you mentioned is, I'm not sure if it was you, Michael, or Lee-Ann, who mentioned this, was the internal teams. And internal fraud is something that companies don't talk that much, but that usually and this is what we see here, like it's like a fraudster, external fraudster, leveraging a lot of technology, etc. But sometimes, and more than quite often, in fact, internal fraud is a reality, and the fraudster don't have the classic. They're not the classic guy criminal, you know. They are just taking because they need or they had an appetite for, they needed money once, and then there is a repeated fraud, internal fraud, etc. And this is something that need to be really well understood as well, and taken into account when considering the fraud issue globally, internal fraud as well as external fraud. Fraud and the new tactics of fraud is a big part of the report, and obviously no buzzword here, but the involvement of AI in fraud and the use of AI by fraudster. 118% increase compared to last year in terms of use of generative AI. Lee-Ann, this is a topic I know you love. Fraudsters are leveraging AI at scale today. How can businesses balance innovation with security to ensure AI is not working against them? This is a This is a question that costs could wait millions that everybody's asking. The opportunity or the cost of AI. There is no, I guess, clear and clear answer. But thank you for sharing.
Yeah. So the battle against AI-powered fraud is really going to depend on how well your company adapts their data strategy, because it is about data. So to balance AI innovation and security, you also have to have the goal of preventing this AI-driven fraud, because AI is also being harnessed for good and for evil. So we have to know how to mitigate those risks. So we know how fraudsters are already using AI to exploit businesses. They're using BEC scams, deepfakes we've all heard about, large-scale phishing schemes, AI bots. I mean, they can test stolen credit cards at scale, which is what's making it more prevalent. There's cyber attacks, malware, and these are large, sophisticated attacks on companies. So we know how they're doing it with AI. And now, to ensure that we can still be innovative as companies, we have to, like I said earlier, fight fire with fire. Use AI to defend against these AI-powered fraudsters. And there's many ways to do it. There's many solutions, but predictive analytics, real-time monitoring. I like anomaly detection. The banks use that. I think that's really helpful. For companies, there's AI-powered vendor risk assessment, and this can be real-time information for companies. And then to do this, though, you have to build a strong security framework for innovation. And for this, again, you need C-suite buy-in, you need the resources, you need the training, and you need the personnel. And the only way we're going to fight it is if companies are given the same information and power that the fraudsters are able to use with AI. And it just comes back down to, if you want AI in your companies, which you should, security has to be at the top of everybody's mind and the top of the resource spend.
I think Baptiste, you're on mute.
Thank you, Michael. Anyone else want to share insights about the use of AI? So we're good, and this is exactly the details we wanted to go through. So basically, we asked in the survey which tactics are used by fraudster, and the first one is still business email compromise for 63% of cases. Second one is for 24% of the answers, companies reported the use of Gen AI. And the third one is for 17%, the use of video conferencing tools. I think it's really interesting because, in fact, the use of Gen AI can be really mixed into everything else. And so at the end, when you figure out what is really important here, and in any fraud schemes, we clearly see that at the end, the issue is the data. You receive an information and you're not able to make sure that this information is relevant or not, and it seems relevant. So we will, I guess, it will be hard to find just one way to block the fraudster from sharing data. They will find a way to share data in new ways, and Gen AI has been so useful. We have seen that over the last 2 years to improve business email compromise, in fact, to make sure that the spelling was perfect, to make sure that the context of the email was absolutely perfect, etc. So it's really a mix of everything that leads at the end to business email compromise being the first, still the first techniques, but involving AI and doing this in a very good way. So, Gloria, I don't know how we can share about that. This is a topic we discussed during the rehearsal, and how you imagine that companies can stay ahead of this of business email compromise today, and how they can improve their weakness on this.
Yeah, I think both Lee-Ann and Michael touched on this quite a bit, which is we need an end-to-end solution. It's not one department. It's everybody needs to have a cohesive, holistic strategy in terms of how we tackle potential fraud. I do think education and culture shift is really, really important. Like, and you can implement a specific tooling, but ultimately, like being able to bring everybody into the same level of understanding of how do we embed that culture in our day-to-day is really, really important. I do think traditionally when we're looking about fraud detection, we looked at specific data sets. It's like, oh, like let's make sure that we validate or let's add in an additional control targets. Nowadays, I do think we have to look at the end-to-end operating model and to make sure there isn't a single point of attack. There isn't a single vulnerable loop, right? And a lot of the time, it does require us to build more robust data points instead of just making one checks or just making one additional approval process. How do we bring the data sets across every single department into a holistic view? And then therefore everybody have a much better tooling. And then taking a step back as well, even from a market perspective, right? Because typically us as financial institutions, we deal with a whole market, we deal with a whole segment. We are looking to build a similar trend, which is let's not just look at payment related data. Let's not just look at vendor related data. Let's bring on the sophistication across cyber, across user behaviors, across vendor, across bank, across device, like all of the data that could potentially touch your entire payment process, your entire operating model, maybe even upstreams and downstream data. Let's bring that holistic view together because that's what fraudsters are using. They don't say, oh, I only use one institution's data, right? Like they actually mine data that's available out there in the public space. One more point I actually was an inspiration point that Leah mentioned is around data security. Like sometimes it's also having a robust control over where do we share data, where do we leak data that potentially allows fraudsters to attack, right? Like to potentially give them a loophole to come in and then benefit from that through their own means. So that's definitely something that we haven't really focused on as much, but it's an interesting angle to kind of review from operating model perspective.
Great. One, and I think one very interesting thing here is all the time, payment fraud is related to a third party, and I think this is where we really bridge or fill the gaps between procurement and treasury and all the teams. And how do you see that, Michael? So 8% of only 8% of companies are checking suppliers' credential all over the P2P process. So that's really few. While at the end, payments is related to third parties. How do you see that? How Foster can how companies can stop this, and maybe I think this is what you said before, stop focusing only on the onboarding, but considering the whole life cycle of a third party with in a company.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually quite shocking, yeah, that 8% of companies only check supplier credentials across all areas of the P2P process. That is quite shocking, right? If you think about it. And it just kind of maybe re-emphasizes what we talked about earlier, which is, yes, of course, procurement is at the forefront of onboarding a supplier and asking all the right things, and the bank account validation, tax validation, all these types of things. But as I said earlier, that's when the journey starts, right? I haven't bought a single thing at the point of a contract. I've just committed the company, or I've committed on behalf of the company that we are in business together, and we're going to start buying certain things from this supplier or services or goods and services. But there are so many other elements of the journey, right? Now I'm going to start raising a requisition. Hopefully that's what you do. You raise a purchase order. Hopefully that supplier flips that PO into an invoice, sends that back electronically. And, if you're a customer of the company I work for, you can make the payments directly out of our platform. So what that allows you to do is to break down those silos we talked about earlier, making sure you onboard the supplier with all the right credentials, which is not just bank account validation, but it's also tax validation and other validations, address and ownership structure, and we need to make sure that they are not somehow linked to a restricted country. So asking all those right questions up front and doing it in one single platform, that has been, the strategy, or at least the intent of the company I work for. But it's quite shocking that only 8% actually do that, because there are so many other elements of that journey as that supplier is in your ecosystem, and things change all the time, right? Companies change, ownerships change, bank accounts change, and you have to put some of the onus on the supplier, but you also need to have the right process in place internally to validate what that supplier has submitted, and that's of course, where a company like Trustpair is critical.
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead, Lee-Ann.
Baptiste, sorry. Good points, Michael. And the banks do KYC and verification on companies every single year. So if that's being done on us, we should certainly be doing it on the people that we are making payments to, our suppliers and vendors. So that's a shockingly low number.
Yeah, and it's surprisingly low, but when you see the next figures, which is the overconfidence that is enlightened in the survey, you have only 8% of companies checking vendors all over the P2P process, but 90% of executives are confident that they will spot vendor cyber fraud. And in the meantime, almost 50% of them are losing more than 10 million a year. You say, well, who is reading the right figures here? So how do you see that, and how? What is your reaction when you see this overconfidence?
For me, it's reputation, right? The C-suite and the executives are overconfident in these answers because they got to make sure the company looks good. But overconfidence in fraud defenses manifests as complacency. And I think this is where we're going wrong. And I don't believe that companies have the right to be so confident given the numbers and the losses that we've seen in this survey so far.
Yeah, I think, and I'm sure Gloria, you want to chime in as well, but I'll be very quick. It's kind of the biggest challenge that I've always had as a procurement practitioner is how to explain to a CFO the importance of it, because fraud is of course an element of risk, right? It's risk management, and fraud in my brain is kind of an element of your overall overarching risk management process, if you will. Is why does that matter? Can I quantify risk? Can I quantify fraud? You're often talking about something that hopefully never happens, but it's hard to put a price tag on it, right? It's like if I say saving money, it's easy, right? Or cost avoidance, or inflation, or executives have the tendency to say, well, where does that show up in my P&L? And of course, fraud shows up in the P&L in a massive way if and when it happens. And it's not a question of if, it's when, as we know, history has shown us. But it's very hard to quantify and then articulate why I need resources, people or technology or both. So I think that the challenge is a little bit there, is how do we quantify the importance of having proper mitigation processes in place?
Absolutely. Gloria,
Yeah,
you want to build on this?
absolutely. I do think a lot of the time fraud prevention is brought onto the agenda on a reactive way. It's because you have been hit by a fraud, and then they realize, oh, like I have gaps. I need to bring the solutions, and I need to have a strategy around it. And until then, a lot of executives are feeling very confident, believing that they have a robust a framework, right? That's one. Two is having some form of measurements or some form of prevention tool doesn't mean it's effective. And I think until you're being tested in the market and you get hit by a fraud, then you realize you have a gap. So I do think it's also challenging for a lot of executives to understand where do they hit the bar? Like, what is the industry best practice? What should they be holding themselves up against? And it's on as I said, like I think a lot of the executive have the commitment to make sure there is a robust framework. It's very hard to have a very measurable framework to say this is what should be implemented. This should be the bar that everybody says to themselves.
Absolutely. Thank you. Just I will go through two or three slides that are very related, and I think that will allow you to summarize, being careful of the time. Very surprising still is the continued reliance on manual prevention methods. 69% of companies are still checking bank accounts and doing callbacks, etc., to check bank account ownership. That's just crazy when you figure out the use of generative AI. You're not even sure that you're talking to the right person on the phone. You're not even sure that the email you receive has been sent by the right person. So that's completely surprisingly crazy, surprisingly high. 43%, so almost half of companies have invested in fraud awareness training over the last 12 months. Yes, meaning that they still involve people, invest in people. And I think it's interesting because and when I think it's related to what you just said about executive are confident because they see some budget invested in training to their team, saying, "Hey, yes, we have invested in we are training our team on a monthly basis, etc." Yes, but people and the new fraud techniques cannot will completely overwhelm the manual controls that are implemented. So that's first very interesting part. The second one is the silos within companies. 48% of companies identified the top challenge in fraud prevention is siloed processes. So basically, what we have been discussing since the beginning of this webinar: lack of communication, team alignment, etc. Probably lack of ownership, and probably, and we'll get your views on this because of the overconfidence of the management. So everybody's in charge, so nobody is really responsible for it. But company-wide, only 9% of executives say that fraud prevention should be the responsibility of multiple departments. So everybody but nobody. So big budgets, but not to the right place. What is your analysis of these few figures, Lee-Ann, maybe?
Yeah, I think it's concerning for sure because somebody has to be responsible, and it's a top-down approach, and you've got to use a RACI chart when it comes to who is responsible and accountable for these projects. Because yes, we all have to be involved. We have to break down those silos. We have to improve data sharing and reduce redundancies. But ultimately, somebody has to have the budget, the resources, and the responsibility for these type of projects. So I think I understand why executives are saying that in small numbers, but we got to change that. We got to make sure that we know who's ultimately responsible for this project and who are the stakeholders that are interested and affected in this type of fraud awareness.
Michael?
Yeah, no, I mean, not much to add there. I 100% agree. It's not a shock, but it's a shock. And so what I encourage everyone to do is take the survey results that you guys have put out there, go talk to your executive and explain why this is a big deal and what the ramifications can be if you don't make the proper investments. I mean, that's what I would say.
Gloria, do you want to share an insight about that?
Completely agree with Lee-Ann and Michael is saying as well. Like, I think we do need to take actions. It is pretty shocking, some of the metrics that came out. I was definitely expecting higher numbers for some of those. I also do think we need to have collaboration across the industry. We need to promote best practices. We need to bring on awareness on what are the toolings available, what are the lessons learned from other executives to really bringing awareness across the industry.
Thank you. It's clear, and what I'm taking from this discussion is there are always three components to consider when we talk about fraud prevention. There is the data. So here, validation. Who is doing this validation? So can I rely on the data that I have in my system? So first, data. Second one is the people owning this data, doing these controls today, and they are usually responsible for the data. And the third component is the tool, where data is hosted. People are managing the data, but they are using tools as well. And if you don't consider these three components in any fraud prevention, basically you're losing. You have still a breach in your defense, because fraudster will always find a way to send a fraudulent data, or the team won't have the right process, or the right awareness, or the right tool to manage it. So data, people, and tools are the three key components of any fraud prevention. This is basically what we considered when we started to, and when we built Trustpair as a fraud prevention platform: automate bank account validation, automate the fact that you can really rely and trust the data you receive, but as well break the silos within the organization by having both procurement, AP teams, treasury teams working on the same platform. And doesn't matter if you're a big organization or a small one, doesn't matter if you have multiple ERPs, different treasury systems, different procurement platforms, will be here to break these silos for you and to bring this confidence at the control level, but as well as the visibility on the risk at the board level. So thank you very much, all of you, for your insights. We are out of time, and it was very, really insightful for me, and I guess I'm sure for everybody who attended. It was great having you. Thank you for the preparation. It was really great working all together.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Have a good end of the day.
Bye.